The studio was bathed in artificial light, the kind that made everything look sharper, more defined. Tucker Carlson sat in the interview chair, legs crossed, hands resting calmly in his lap. The famous smirk played on his lips, but his eyes were alert, scanning his surroundings. Across from him, the host, a young, eager journalist from CNN, shuffled his notes, adjusting his earpiece. The tension in the air was thick, almost tangible, as if the entire room knew what was about to unfold. The cameras rolled. Millions of viewers were watching. The host leaned forward, offering a tight smile, the kind that disguised a knife behind the back. Before we continue this story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you enjoy heartfelt stories like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this story, so after watching, leave a comment below and tell us what you think. And don't forget, tomorrow, we have another inspiring story just for you. Tucker, you've built a career on what some call strategic misinformation. Do you ever wonder about the consequences of your words? His voice was smooth, rehearsed, the calculated confidence of a man who believed he had the upper hand. Carlson didn't flinch. He let the question hang in the air, the silence stretching just long enough to create discomfort. He tilted his head slightly, as if considering something amusing. "Define misinformation," he finally said, his voice calm, almost casual, but there was an edge to it, a warning. The host's fingers curled around his cue cards, his grin tightening. "Well, let's start with this." He lifted a document, waving it slightly before placing it on the table between them. "According to internal memos from your former network, certain segments on your show deliberately misled the audience. You knowingly spread false claims." A flicker of interest crossed Carlson's face, but he remained still. The host pressed on, sensing an opportunity. "Would you like to comment on why you kept pushing narratives that even your own network admitted were not entirely accurate?" The trap was set. The host leaned back, waiting. The studio audience, mostly hand-picked to ensure the right kind of energy, shifted in their seats. The control room was silent, producers holding their breath. This was the moment they had been waiting for, the moment Carlson would be exposed, forced to either backpedal or lash out in defense. But Carlson did neither. He exhaled slowly, letting his fingers tap lightly against the armrest. He glanced at the document on the table, then back at the host. His expression didn't change, but something in the room did. A subtle shift, a tightening in the air. He chuckled, a quiet, almost imperceptible sound, then leaned forward slightly, just enough to make the host instinctively pull back. "You know," he said, his voice lowering, steady as ever, "it's always interesting when people like you talk about misinformation." The host blinked, momentarily thrown off by the shift in tone. Carlson continued, his voice never rising, but carrying the weight of a man who had seen this play before. "Because what you're really saying isn't that I was wrong. What you're saying is that I was effective, and that scares you, doesn't it?" The host's mouth opened slightly, as if forming a rebuttal, but Carlson didn't give him the chance. He picked up the document, flipping through it with the kind of detached amusement one might have while reading an old grocery list. Then he set it back down. "This is interesting, but let me ask you something. Just for fun, who wrote this memo?" Silence. The host hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, but it was enough. The control room saw it, the audience saw it, the viewers at home saw it, and Tucker Carlson saw it. The game had already begun, but the players were not who they seemed. The studio was a carefully crafted battlefield, designed not just for discussion but for control. The lighting was bright but strategic, illuminating the host's side of the table just a little more than Carlson's. The backdrop, a sleek and modern design with the network's logo subtly glowing, projected an air of authority. The audience, though mostly out of focus on the cameras, was carefully curated, diverse, expressive, and, most importantly, responsive. Producers had positioned people who would nod at the right moments, react to the host's jabs, and create the illusion of an organic response. Tucker Carlson sat comfortably in his chair, his posture relaxed but deliberate. He wasn't slouched, but he wasn't rigid either. His suit was sharp, understated, the tie perfectly knotted. His face, familiar to millions, carried that same expression that had become his signature. Mild amusement with an undercurrent of scrutiny, as if he were constantly evaluating, waiting for the moment when the facade would crack. Across from him, the host sat with a different kind of energy. He was younger, polished, the product of years spent climbing the ranks of mainstream media. He wore a tailored suit, just a touch too tight in an attempt to exude confidence, his tie chosen for contrast against the blue tones of the studio. He had done his homework. He had watched hours of Carlson's debates, memorized his tactics, prepared counters for each one. This wasn't going to be just another interview, this was an ambush. The control room buzzed with quiet urgency. Multiple camera angles were prepped to catch every shift in expression, every micro-reaction. There was a slight delay in the broadcast, a precautionary measure. The producers had planned for everything, except perhaps the possibility that the plan might backfire. The first exchange had already set the tone. The host had thrown his first real punch with the memo, but Carlson hadn't reacted the way he was supposed to. Instead of flustering or dodging, he had done something more dangerous. He had remained completely still, letting the weight of the moment settle. It was a power move, one the host hadn't expected this early. The audience was engaged, but not yet fully leaning in. Some smirked, enjoying the opening salvo, while others sat with arms crossed, waiting for the real blows to land. The host, feeling the pressure to regain control, adjusted his seating slightly, shifting forward as if trying to shrink the space between them. His fingers drummed lightly against the table, a nearly imperceptible sign of urgency. He needed to reset the rhythm before Carlson dictated it. The air in the studio had changed. It was no longer just an interview, it was a game of chess, and both players knew it. The host had been counting on Carlson playing defense, reacting, scrambling to justify, but instead Carlson was watching, measuring, waiting. He wasn't here to apologize. He wasn't here to explain himself. He was here to let the host walk into his own trap. Somewhere behind the cameras, a producer signaled to pick up the tempo. The host saw it from the corner of his eye and took a steadying breath. It was time to push harder. The next question needed to land differently. He leaned in, his voice dropping just slightly, giving it the calculated intimacy of a setup. Let's talk about accountability, Tucker. You've built an entire career on calling out hypocrisy, yet your own network admitted, off the record of course, that some of your statements were misleading. So tell me, when do you take responsibility for the damage you've done? It was a carefully crafted question, designed not just to challenge, but to force Carlson into a corner, a softer touch than an outright accusation, but laced with enough venom to make it stick. The host knew that public perception was often shaped by how someone looked while answering, not just by the answer itself. He was betting on Carlson shifting in his seat, on hesitation, on a glance downward, anything that could be replayed in clips and analyzed in articles. But Carlson didn't move. He didn't blink. Instead, his lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. His eyes, sharp and assessing, met the host's with a steady intensity. The silence stretched, turning the moment into something heavier than the host had intended. Then, finally, Carlson exhaled, slow and deliberate, before speaking. "I appreciate the question," he said, his tone light but unmistakably pointed. "It's interesting, though. People like you only talk about accountability when it's convenient. Tell me, where was this concern when your own network ran with narratives that turned out to be less than truthful?" The audience shifted. A few murmurs rippled through the room. The host's jaw tightened slightly, and Carlson saw it. He saw the flicker of doubt, the brief calculation behind the eyes. He had expected Carlson to justify, to defend, but now the roles were reversing. The host had laid out his move, and Carlson had calmly slid it back across the table, daring him to address the hypocrisy in his own industry. In the control room, a producer made a note on the rundown. This wasn't going as planned. The host needed to regain control. He needed to press forward to keep Carlson on the ropes. But the problem was clear now. Carlson wasn't on the ropes. He was standing in the center of the ring, waiting for the next swing. The host adjusted his tie, shifting slightly in his chair. The control room was signaling him to push harder, to start chipping away at Carlson's composure. He had expected this interview to be a battle, but he had also expected to be the one in control. Instead, Carlson sat there, perfectly still, his expression unreadable, waiting. That smirk hadn't faded, and that was a problem. The host needed to change the energy, force Carlson to play defense. He glanced at his notes and decided to escalate. "You've built a career on pushing narratives that fuel division," the host said, his voice steady but edged with something sharper now. "You've questioned elections, pushed conspiracies, and entertained extremists, and yet you sit here acting as if you're just asking harmless questions. Do you ever stop and think about the consequences of your rhetoric?" He let the words hang in the air, giving the audience time to absorb them. He could feel the energy shift. There was anticipation now, a hunger for a reaction. This was the moment they had been waiting for. The beginning of Carlson's reckoning. Carlson exhaled slowly, glancing around the room as if taking stock of the atmosphere. Then, finally, he turned his gaze back to the host. "That's interesting," he said, tilting his head slightly. "I've always thought it was the job of journalists to ask questions, but apparently that's only acceptable when the questions align with your network's preferred narrative." His voice was measured, almost amused, but there was no mistaking the weight behind his words. The host didn't flinch. "It's not about asking questions, Tucker. It's about responsibility. Your platform gives you influence, and when you spread misinformation, when you pander to fears, when you create an alternate reality for your audience." He paused for effect, then delivered the line he had been saving. "At what point does that make you just another propagandist?" There it was, the word designed to stick. Propagandist. The host knew exactly what he was doing. The audience murmured, a few heads nodding in agreement, some leaning forward as if to catch every detail. The moment had been carefully manufactured. The host expected Carlson to react, maybe a flash of anger, maybe an attempt at deflection. But Carlson didn't do either. Instead, he let out a small chuckle, shaking his head slightly. "You know," Carlson said, adjusting his cufflinks, "it's always fascinating to hear lectures on responsibility from people who work in corporate media. The same people who told us the Iraq War was justified, who pushed the Steele dossier as fact, who framed anyone questioning their narratives as dangerous. And now, after all that, you want to sit here and moralize about misinformation?" The room tensed. That wasn't the answer the host had been prepared for. He had expected Carlson to defend himself, not to go on the offensive. He opened his mouth, ready to counter, but Carlson wasn't finished. "I don't mind tough questions," Carlson continued, his voice still calm, but with an unmistakable sharpness now. "But let's not pretend this is about journalism. This is about control. You don't want people thinking for themselves. You want them to accept whatever version of reality you package and sell. And when someone challenges that, when someone asks inconvenient questions, you don't debate them. You label them conspiracist, extremist, propagandist. Because if you can brand them as dangerous, you don't have to engage with what they're actually saying." The host felt his pulse quicken. This was slipping. He needed to regain control. "That's a clever deflection," he said, forcing a smirk. "But let's stay on track. Carlson leaned forward slightly, just enough to make the host instinctively shift back. "Oh, I think we are on track," he said, voice dropping just a notch lower, his eyes locked onto the host's. "You're the one who brought up responsibility, so let's talk about it. When does your network take responsibility for the narratives it gets wrong, or does accountability only work one way?" A murmur spread through the audience. The host's expression tightened for just a fraction of a second, but Carlson saw it. The control room saw it. The viewers at home saw it. The balance of power in the room had shifted, and for the first time, the host wasn't sure how to take it back. The host inhaled sharply, recalibrating. He had walked into this interview expecting a fight, but not one where he would be the one retreating. Carlson was too comfortable, too composed, and that wasn't how this was supposed to go. The control room had already signaled for him to push harder, to take back control before the dynamic shifted completely. He glanced at his notes, searching for the next move, something definitive, something that would force Carlson off balance. He found it. "All right, the host said, adjusting his papers, his tone now more clipped. You want to talk about accountability? Let's talk about what happened on your former network. Internal messages show that you privately dismissed claims of election fraud while continuing to entertain them on air. That's not just asking questions, Tucker. That's deliberately misleading your audience. So, tell me, what's the difference between that and what you claim my network does? The words landed hard, exactly as intended. The audience murmured, the tension in the studio rising. The host had just accused Carlson of hypocrisy, of knowingly deceiving his viewers, of playing both sides for ratings. He expected Carlson to shift, to stammer, to search for a way out. Instead, Carlson let the questions sit in the air, his expression unreadable. Then he slowly leaned back in his chair, crossing one leg over the other, exuding the kind of ease that made his opponent look desperate. "That's an interesting take," Carlson said finally, voice even, unshaken. "But let's get something straight. You're not actually concerned about truth here. If you were, you'd apply that same level of scrutiny to the way your own network operates. You'd ask why certain stories disappear when they become inconvenient. You'd ask why certain guests are never invited back after saying something outside the approved narrative. But you don't, because this isn't about truth. It's about control." The host clenched his jaw slightly. That wasn't an answer. It was a redirect. He couldn't allow Carlson to dictate the pace, to turn this back on him. He straightened in his seat, eyes narrowing. "You're dodging," he shot back. "This isn't about my network. This is about you misleading millions of people for profit. Are you saying you take no responsibility for that?" Carlson's smirk widened just slightly. "I'm saying the outrage is selective. If you actually cared about misinformation, you wouldn't just be interrogating me. You'd be asking why your own network spent years running stories that turned out to be false with zero accountability. You'd be asking why intelligence officials falsely discredited a major story before an election, and your network went right along with it. But you won't, because this performance isn't about journalism, it's about punishing people who challenge the narrative you're paid to push." The host exhaled through his nose, steadying himself. He knew this trick. Carlson was trying to shift the burden, to create false equivalence, to erode his credibility rather than answer the question directly. He needed to regain the offensive. He needed something stronger. He flipped to another card. "Fine," he said, voice tightening. "If that's your argument, then let's test it. Let's talk about what happened after January 6th. You promoted the idea that federal agents were involved in orchestrating the riot. That claim was baseless, no evidence supported it, but you pushed it anyway. Do you still stand by that, or are you ready to admit that you were wrong?" The tension in the room deepened. The host had gone nuclear. The control room was silent, waiting to see if this would be the moment Carlson finally stumbled. This was supposed to be the breaking point. The audience, too, was holding its breath, waiting to see how he would respond. Carlson exhaled slowly, his fingers tapping against the armrest. He tilted his head slightly, considering. "You're asking the wrong question," he said finally, his voice softer now but no less sharp. "The question isn't whether I was wrong. The question is why your network was so desperate to shut down any discussion about it at all. Why were people who even asked about federal involvement immediately labeled conspiracy theorists? Why were reasonable questions met with coordinated outrage instead of actual answers?" The host's fingers curled slightly around his cue cards. This was slipping, the rhythm was off. Carlson was controlling the tempo now, dictating the shape of the conversation. He wasn't flustered, he wasn't scrambling. He was turning every attack into an opening of his own. The host glanced briefly toward the control room, catching a glimpse of a producer gesturing, "Move on. Pivot." They had expected Carlson to crack under pressure, but instead, he was doing what he had always done, making himself impossible to corner. The host squared his shoulders, pressing forward. "So that's it?" he said, trying to regain ground. "Instead of answering directly, you just throw out more questions, more speculation, more distractions? That's how misinformation spreads, Tucker. It's not about facts. It's about sowing doubt. You create just enough uncertainty to make the truth feel optional." Carlson let out a short breath, almost a laugh, shaking his head slightly. "You're not actually interested in a conversation," he said, and this time, his tone was different. not amused, not playful. There was something sharper there now, something cutting. You came in here thinking you had me in a corner. You thought you could control this narrative, but let's be honest, you're not asking questions. You're making accusations and pretending they're journalism. The audience was no longer fully on the host's side. The murmurs weren't just nods of approval anymore. There was uncertainty now, an awareness that something was shifting. The control room saw it too. The host saw it, and Carlson saw it. The host opened his mouth to fire back, but Carlson wasn't finished. He leaned forward slightly, eyes locked on his opponent. Tell me something. When this interview is over, do you already know what the headline is going to be? Because I do. And that's the difference between you and me. You came here with a conclusion already written. I came here to have a conversation. And the fact that you can't handle that, that's the real story. The control room scrambled. This wasn't going as planned. The host could feel it slipping further, the energy in the room shifting. He needed to recover, to take back control before it was too late. But Carlson was already leaning back in his chair again, completely at ease. He knew exactly what had just happened. And so did everyone watching. The air in the studio was different now. The control room could feel it, the audience could sense it, and most importantly, the host could see it in Tucker Carlson's eyes. The interview had started as an ambush, carefully structured to corner him, to extract a moment of weakness that could be clipped, dissected, and turned into a headline. But now, the dynamic had shifted. The host was still talking, still pressing, but the weight of the room had changed. Carlson wasn't on the defensive anymore. He was waiting. The host, determined to claw back control, straightened in his chair, his voice sharpening. You keep dodging, Tucker. You refuse to answer a direct question, and that's exactly the problem. You hide behind speculation and misdirection because the truth doesn't serve you. So let's cut through the noise. Do you or do you not acknowledge that the rhetoric you pushed contributed to political violence in this country? A definitive blow, framed as a demand for accountability but really a no-win trap. If Carlson denied it outright, the host would accuse him of ignoring reality. If he engaged, he would be forced to defend a position carefully designed to make him look reckless. The host sat back, satisfied. This was the moment. The audience was watching, the control room was watching, millions at home were watching. Millions at home were watching. But Carlson didn't respond right away. He let the question settle, the silence stretching out just long enough to feel unnatural. The host shifted slightly, waiting. Then Carlson smiled. Not the amused smirk he had carried for most of the interview, but something different. A smile that said, "I've been waiting for this moment." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, his voice dropping just enough to pull the entire room into the conversation. "That's fascinating," he said, shaking his head slightly, as if in genuine disbelief. "Because I've sat in this chair for almost an hour now, listening to you accuse me of manipulating people, of spreading dangerous ideas, of creating division. And yet, here you are, doing exactly that." The host blinked. "That's..." Carlson raised a hand slightly, stopping him. "Now, let's be honest for a second. You don't actually care about violence. You don't care about the consequences of rhetoric. If you did, you wouldn't have spent the last several years justifying riots when they fit your political narrative. You wouldn't have dismissed violence as mostly peaceful when the people doing it were on your side. You wouldn't have spent weeks rationalizing unrest while pretending that words only have consequences when you decide they do." The audience was no longer sitting still. There was a murmur, a shift, as if something invisible had just broken open. The host felt it. His jaw tightened, but Carlson wasn't finished. "You ask about responsibility." Carlson continued, his voice never rising but carrying more weight than anything the host had said all night. "So let's talk about it. Where was your network's responsibility when it pushed a false narrative that led to real harm? When businesses were burned, when people lost everything, and your reporters stood in front of the flames and called it justice? Where was this same energy then?" The host opened his mouth, but Carlson kept going, pressing forward now, turning the table completely. "You came here tonight with a script," he said, shaking his head slightly. "You thought I'd get defensive. You thought I'd backpedal, maybe even apologize. But you never considered the possibility that I might ask you to answer for your words. And that's the real problem, isn't it? You're not interested in accountability. You're interested in control. The studio was no longer the host's domain. The audience was no longer nodding on cue. The producer in the control room was gesturing wildly, signaling for the host to pivot, to redirect, to do something before this completely slipped away. But Carlson wasn't done. He leaned back, exhaling slowly, as if the weight of the hypocrisy in the room was almost amusing. "I'll make this simple," he said, his tone turning almost conversational now. "If words are as dangerous as you claim, then you're just as guilty as the people you spend your time attacking. If misinformation is truly a crisis, then your network should be the first to answer for its role in it. But we both know that's not going to happen, because this was never about truth. It was about making sure people like me don't get to speak at all." The control room made the call. The screen abruptly cut to a commercial. The audience gasped, some looking around, unsure if this was planned or an emergency decision. The host looked down, pretending to shuffle his notes, but his expression was tight, his lips pressed together in frustration. He knew what had just happened. He had lost control, and worse, everyone had seen it. Carlson sat back in his chair, watching as the lights dimmed and the cameras cut. He knew the interview wasn't over, but in reality, it already was. The moment had been sealed, and when the broadcast resumed, nothing the host said would be able to undo it. The screen faded to black for a fraction of a second before the network's logo appeared, followed by the familiar jingle that signaled a commercial break had ended. When the cameras came back on, the host was seated exactly where he had been before, but everything about him looked different now. His posture was stiffer, his expression strained. He had spent the last 60 seconds off air being bombarded with frantic messages from producers in his earpiece, telling him to regain control, to pivot, to salvage the moment. But it was too late. Everyone watching at home knew what had just happened. They had seen it in real time. The control wasn't his anymore. Tucker Carlson, on the other hand, looked completely unchanged. He sat back in his chair, his expression neutral, but with the faintest glint of satisfaction in his eyes. He wasn't gloating. He didn't have to. He had won, and everyone in the room could feel it. The host inhaled deeply, pushing forward with the only move he had left: pretend nothing had happened. He adjusted his papers, forcing a polite smile, his voice smoothing into its usual practiced cadence. "Well, that was an interesting discussion," he said, as if the last 10 minutes hadn't been a complete collapse of his control over the interview. "I think we can agree that these are important issues, and—" Carlson tilted his head slightly, amused. "Oh, we're wrapping up already?" he said, his voice carrying just enough sarcasm to cut through the host's attempt at a reset. The host's fingers curled slightly against the desk. He could feel the weight of the cameras on him, the control room waiting for him to salvage the ending. He forced another smile. "We're out of time," he said, his tone clipped but measured, rehearsed to sound casual. "But I appreciate you coming on and—" Carlson nodded slowly, exhaling in a way that made it clear he knew exactly what was happening. "Of course, we're out of time," he repeated, letting the words linger just long enough for their real meaning to sink in. They weren't out of time because the segment had naturally run its course. They were out of time because the network had decided they were. Because Carlson had flipped the script, and the only way to contain the damage was to cut the conversation short. The host's jaw tightened. He knew Carlson was right, and worse, he knew the audience knew it too. He could already imagine the clips being uploaded, the headlines forming, the reaction online. This was supposed to be his moment, the one where he exposed Tucker Carlson, where he made him stumble. Instead, the opposite had happened. Carlson hadn't just defended himself. He had turned the entire conversation into an indictment of the very people trying to silence him. The closing credits began to roll on the screen. The host forced one last line, hoping to regain some sense of authority. "Tucker Carlson, always an interesting conversation," he said, his voice strained with the effort of pretending he hadn't just lost control of his own show. Carlson smiled, standing up as the camera zoomed out. He reached across the table, extending his hand. The host hesitated for the briefest second before shaking it, knowing he had no choice. The moment was small, almost insignificant in the grand scheme of the broadcast, but it was one more silent victory. Carlson didn't just leave on his terms. He left with the last word, the last image, the last impression burned into the minds of millions watching at home. As the studio lights dimmed and the show officially cut to its next segment, the host exhaled sharply, finally allowing his shoulders to drop. The control room was already in chaos, producers scrambling to figure out how to frame what had just happened, how to spin it, how to keep it from spreading. But it was pointless. The damage was done. Carlson walked out of the studio with the same steady, unhurried pace he had walked in with. He didn't check his phone, he didn't need to. He already knew what was happening. Within minutes, clips of the interview would be flooding social media, the headlines would be rolling in, and the public would be dissecting every second of what had just taken place. The narrative had slipped from the network's grasp, and now it belonged to the people. By the time he stepped outside into the crisp night air, his name was already trending worldwide. He smiled to himself, shaking his head. They had thought they could control the conversation. They had thought they could silence him. They were wrong. Within minutes, the internet exploded. Clips of the interview flooded social media, spreading at a speed no network could contain. The hashtag #TuckerWins surged to the top of Twitter trends, followed closely by CNN Meltdown and Media Exposed. Posts dissecting every second of the exchange racked up millions of views, with side-by-side comparisons showing the host's confidence unraveling in real time. Memes appeared almost instantly. Carlson's smirk frozen in a victorious frame. The host's stunned silence captioned with variations of "processing, please wait." Commentators from all sides weighed in. Some called it one of the greatest dismantlings of mainstream media bias ever broadcast, while others desperately tried to frame it as a bad faith debate with a known provocateur. But no amount of damage control could change what people had already seen. The full interview, unedited and raw, was being shared across every platform. Independent creators uploaded reaction videos, pausing to highlight key moments where Carlson had flipped the script. Even those who didn't typically support him admitted, like him or not, that was a masterclass. On network television, the fallout was immediate. CNN's morning panel attempted to downplay the disaster, insisting that the interview didn't go as planned, but important questions were raised. The host, clearly rattled, appeared on another segment, claiming that Carlson had dodged accountability and that viewers should focus on the real issues, not the performance. But it was too late. The clip of him losing control had already become the story. The network's PR team scrambled to contain the narrative, releasing statements about misinformation and bad faith arguments. But none of it mattered. Even in mainstream comment sections, people weren't buying it. "This is why trust in media is dead," one viral reply read. "They tried to set him up and he walked out untouched." By nightfall, the interview had surpassed 5 million views across platforms, and the numbers were climbing. The most watched moment? The second the network cut to commercial mid-interview. "That's when you know you've lost," someone tweeted, earning 100,000 likes in minutes. Meanwhile, Carlson remained silent. No follow-up statements, no responses to the chaos unfolding online. He didn't need to say anything. The clip spoke for itself. And by morning, even the network's own analysts would be forced to acknowledge what had happened. They hadn't trapped Carlson. He had trapped them.